Hey there, my name is Daniel Speiss. I've spent years studying MBTI, have a background in psychology and sales and business, and I'm currently working on a new and enhanced model personality theory called PRISM. And I'm excited to talk about why MBTI isn't just wrong. It's not just wrong, it's incomplete. And I want to tell you a little bit more about my journey and what we as a culture and population miss in the pop culture of personality theories, why it's so buzzwordy, why it's so easy to connect to, almost like horoscopes. And we're going to get into the reasons why it has some issues, and we're going to talk about how we can compensate for those challenges in different ways, and specifically speaking, the new model that I'm working on. When I first got into MBTI years ago, this must be 10, 12 years ago, I was typed as an ENFJ. And really the reason why I was typed as an ENFJ was I just had this growth fixation, this curiosity, this passion to learn about people, how people worked. And to me, MBTI was a great starting foundation of learning about how people could work. Cognitive functions, extroverted, introversion, sensing, thinking, feeling, judging, all those cognitive functions. It was really cool. And over time, I realized that profile made less and less sense to me as I started to relate to other ENFJs and other emotional types. And then eventually what ended up happening was I migrated my understanding from thinking I was an ENFJ to an ENTJ in later years, and where I'm at today. In this theory, I would say I'm probably the ENTJ, or one profile very similar. I don't even really care what I am in MBTI land anymore, just because it's so inaccurate. And we're going to talk about those. And you're going to notice that in this conversation, I'm not showing up here to speak ill of MBTI in itself. It has come such a long way between Jung and the founders of MBTI. But my role here is to really catch you up to speed to where these bottlenecks are in the system, and how we can compensate, understand, become more aware, implement these slight changes, and how we can see this in a more dynamic light, and then going forward, transform our lives, right? That's a short snippet on me. I helped create and run a YouTube channel called MBTV for a very long time, now known as True Generations. We did a lot of educational content on MBTI there, and you can see a lot of my videos there still. So more than happy to check those out. I do a lot of good content on dating and relationships. Let's start off with a big item here. And one of the biggest flaws we have here is the mistyping is built in. What do I mean by that? MBTI often misidentifies people because it uses binary labels, right? F versus T, S versus N, instead of recognizing blends, right? The biggest fundamental challenge people have when they start connecting and identifying with MBTI is people are dynamic in their current strengths of functions, right? And so what do I mean by that? You could be a thinker and have a very well developed sense of whatever emotional function, right? You can have a stronger FE than normal. You can have a stronger TI than normal. You really want to see those cognitive functions as individual stats that they're not known as a picture perfect of any profile, right? We all have different experiences, right? Recognizing that you can have a blend of strengths of these cognitive functions. Test takers answer based on context or ideals, not reality, right? When we self-type and we have other people type, not only if you're doing a self-assessment and you're kind of bringing in your own values and subjective point of view to what the question is saying, but if you have other people who also don't understand MBTI fundamentally and its drawbacks, and understanding how to objectively answer some of these questions, right? Like if I ask a friend, hey, do you consider yourself to be an extrovert or an introvert? And they say, I'm an introvert. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're an introvert. There's 4 ways that we're introverted, and there's 4 ways that we're extroverted, according to MBTI, right? And other theories. That's too broad of a question to just throw yourself into the cockpit of being one versus another, not even including that it's dynamic right now and over time in your growth. It's a shot in the dark to even get that correct, right? We have to know what we're talking about there, right? For me, personally, I always knew I was an extrovert. I knew I was always social. I never really started to learn about the more nuanced introverted parts of me until I got into more advanced theories like socionics and now what I'm building, PRISM. Mistyping is fundamentally built in. It ignores psychological states, healthy versus unhealthy modes. Now, what do I mean by that? MBTI doesn't distinguish between how a type behaves when thriving versus when under stress, right? It's one thing to be an ENTJ, an ENFJ, an INFJ, but when you are in different states of being, right? When you're an INFJ under stress, or you're an INFJ under happiness and motivation and inspiration, and INFJ being a good place versus a bad place, it doesn't really account for these nuanced states of being, right? You have two INFJs, for example, one's grounded and one's burned out from working too much. They look nothing alike. You take an ENTJ that hasn't really been social like me for a while, because I've been focusing on my business for a really long time, and you compare me to what I looked like a couple of years ago when I lived in Austin and I was going to social events every other day, I looked like two different people, right? Right. You see what I'm saying there? It's a little different. And when we talk about PRISM, it introduces this state modeling, right? Stress shifts, flow states, and burnout, right? The system I'm building and working out, PRISM accounts for this nuance here of how people dynamically, their states dynamically change. No neuroticism or emotional regulation. MBTI doesn't really account for this. MBTI it's cognitively flat, right? Everything is like on one seemingly dimensional plane. It says nothing about emotional reactivity, anxiety, or resilience, right? And this is a tough part, because it's one thing to have a profile of all these different character profile temperaments, but it doesn't really go into how these profiles talk about anxiety, resilience. You know, it's kind of barren there. And yet these traits radically affect how types manifest, right? Let me say that again. These traits radically affect how types manifest. On one hand, you have MBTI and it has all their descriptors, but on the other hand, you have people just inherently do these things, right? They experience anxiety and depression and all of like the spectrum of emotions, and it doesn't really like say anything about that, right? It definitely alludes to how certain profiles handle certain situations, or how each profile has its own relationship with that function, but it doesn't really go that much more into depth, let alone a whole bunch of other things. In PRISM though, someone can be an LIE, for example, which is me, it's like the ENTJ equivalent, but you can be an LIE confident or versus an LIE neurotic, right? Even with the same function stack. In PRISM, we're accounting for the actual state that profile is in at that time, which is really important, because you don't want to just take someone's profile at face value. Great, you're an ENTJ, you're an INFJ, you're an ESTP, whatever. You want to actually account for the actual state they're in presently, right? And it's a very important addition that needs to be accounted for, especially if you're looking to track and map yourself over time, see how you're doing, track your own activity, and how you can help yourself get out of certain circumstances personally, and tracking when you're in a good place and a bad place, right? There's no measurement of strength or dimensionality. So in socionics, there's a concept called dimensionality of strengths, right? For example, if you're an INFJ, your superpower is your intuition, right? And MBTI doesn't really go into dimensionality at all, right? It doesn't go into how strong you are at your functions. You just assume, oh, this is my base function, this is my primary, this is what I'm really great at. MBTI treats all functions equally and doesn't measure how well you use them, right? It's treating functions like one-dimensionally here. It's not, there can't be any commentary on being super great at any of these things. It's just you lead with X, then it accompanies Y, right? INFJs, it's you're leading with intuition, then you're leading with feeling, then you're leading with sensing, then logic, then you're leading with sensing, right? It's this whole thing. It doesn't really go into the strengths, right? With PRISM though, it tracks strengths, how often and powerfully you use function, dimensionality, how flexibly and maturely you use it, one-dimensional to four-dimensional, and real personalities aren't flat hierarchies, right? They're dynamic gradients. Let's tackle each one of these, right? Strengths, how often and powerfully you use a function, right? If you're an INFJ, your superpower is your intuition, your insightfulness, your ability to see the future and to be a visionary, right? And it goes way, socionics in and of by itself does this to a degree, but PRISM adds to this. Dimensionality, right? How we start looking at the 1D to 4D, the one-dimensional to the four-dimensional. This is a really important aspect that I really like building in PRISM, because it's so important that we actually understand our strengths of our current strengths of each cognitive function, or in PRISM, information element, right? It's just a different verbiage and definition. But as somebody who is interested in self-development, you'd want to know your strengths, your strengths across the board, right? And like I've mentioned earlier, everybody is dynamic. So everyone has a different upbringing. Everybody works on their own functions differently. You can have one ESTP, for example, that is really, really strong with force or strong with extroverted sensing. Then you can have an ESTP that had a weird upbringing and wasn't allowed to express his extroverted sensing, the superpower that's natural to him. And so he might have to work on his next one, which is introverted logic, right? And then he just became really great at systems. That's a great example right there of how it's dynamic, where MBTI really doesn't go into that at all. It doesn't really account for how people, that nuance in strengths of functions. And it doesn't really want to actually either. Real personalities aren't flat hierarchies, they're dynamic, right? In that example. It's still recording. Next one we have here is no function interplay. What do we mean by that? MBTI lists functions in a stack, but doesn't explain how they interact or influence each other. It doesn't do a great job at connecting the dots between functions, right? You have an INFJ, introverted intuition, great. How does that connect to their next function, and then the next function, and the next function, right? It doesn't really do a great job at tying them all together and how they express and combine or not. For example, it says you use extroverted feeling, but not how that's shaped by introverted intuition or suppressed by extroverted sensing, right? Socionics does a better job at this, but PRISM maps and blocks this out dynamically and mutual regulation between functions, right? In Socionics and PRISM, it does a little bit better job of actually diving deeper in how the functions interplay with one another. No development path or growth trajectory. The biggest challenge with MBTI is there's really no great information for personal development. You're the type that you're type, and your valued functions, right? And now you're off to the races, right? Versus MBTI says you're an ENTP, right? And there you go. That's it. Pretty much that's all you have to work with. There's no framework for developing weak functions or evolving your type expression, right? Leaning more into who you are, let alone working on the parts of you that are quote unquote just in a black box somewhere, and you don't know how to access and grow those parts of it yourself, which are very present. And Socionics does a way better job at this, but PRISM specifically treats your type as a starting point, not a box, right? What can I grow into? What's emerging? What's collapsing, right? We're always going back to what I was saying earlier, where we're, as a profile, we're in different states. So when you're in depressed states, you don't have access to grow the parts of you that you normally wouldn't value. You normally don't value and you don't give time and effort to, right? For example, as an ENTJ, an MBTI, I'm just thinking here for a second, I would technically have FI as the value, right? I wouldn't be working on the other four cognitive functions, right, if I would be in a depressed state. But MBTI, again, doesn't even acknowledge that there's an oscillation or dynamic nature to, well, you know what? Any personality profile that's in a good state will actually start working on and be more open to work on unvalued cognitive functions. There's no material on that, because it rejects the premise that it rejects the premise merely because these are shadow functions. These are functions that are inaccessible to us consciously, or there's just no material at all that really goes into great detail about the conscious relationship we have with those functions that are not valued, right? No development path or growth trajectory there. And because of that, you can't really rely on MBTI for any really growth for any personal development. Great, I'm an ENTJ, I'm an INFJ, I'm an ESTP, I'm an INFP. Now what? All I know is I have these functions I value and I have these functions I don't value, and I have this profile that makes sense to me and I relate to, but where do I go from there? Static identity equals stagnation. Another big issue with MBTI. MBTI encourages identity lock-in. You're an INFJ, you're an INFJ now, right? If I'm a P type, I can plan. If I'm a feeler, logic isn't my thing. It kind of bottlenecks you. It keeps you quarantined away from these different parts of you that can exist and does express themselves. But because of this whole static identity lock that MBTI just does as an effect of its nature, as a system, it becomes very easy to self-identify with the functions themselves, with the profile, to quarantine ourselves away from growth, and to also to have certain attitudes towards other profiles, right? And we can get into that in another video. This fosters fixed mindsets and excuses for ourselves, right? And PRISM and socionics, again, I'm going to keep mentioning them side by side, because PRISM it's an enhanced extension off of socionics and MBTI. But PRISM, for example, is dynamic. It assumes you change, and your profile should reflect that, right? It's dynamic. It assumes you change, and your profile should reflect that. You're still the same profile, but you're dynamic in your growth. You're dynamic in what you can work on, right? Your strengths aren't set in stone, for example. Your dimensionality isn't set in stone. If you are, like, for example, 3-dimensional and extroverted feeling, right? You can still work on that. It's still being enhanced, right? If you're 1-dimensional in introverted feeling like myself, you can continue to work on that to have a really great strength in it, right? MBTI has become more of pop psychology, right? Without the science. It's kind of been left to culture and society to just kind of take advantage of just what MBTI is known for, to dilute it, for example, I was doing some research yesterday. I was looking at all these different channels, and there's a channel of one guy who creates all these animations based off of the profiles, and you really see kind of a deprecation of the system and of what little it provides, and it only leads society to only propagate more misinformation because it's not a very well intact system, right? MBTI feels good, it's intuitive, affirming, and marketable, right? It's so popular. It's so easy to add it as like a little like subcategory on your Discord or in your business or in a community, but it doesn't really have that much weight, right? In of itself. It's a poor test, retest. It has a poor test, retest reliability, right? Meaning you take a test once, you do it the same test 20, 30 days from now. It's not very accurate. It's not a predictive validity, no predictive validity, and largely unchanged since the 1980s. And this is where I love the work that I'm doing with PRISM, is that I'm updating a lot of the gaps and missing information and nuances that some of these theories fail to address. And PRISM builds on this empirical foundation. You've got trait theory, neuroplasticity, and cognitive science. I'm constantly trying to figure out what studies really reconfirm or affirm the things that I'm building into the theory itself. There's been so many advancements since the 1980s that it definitely is where it's a revisit is needed. No real relationship modeling. MBTI can suggest compatibility, but it lacks a framework for interaction dynamics, co-regulation, emotional feedback loops. So it doesn't really address the nuances with relationships. I'm very big on the co-regulation side. I just did a little quick memo this morning about co-regulation, that your personality profile is very correlated to how you regulate and co-regulate with other people, right? And MBTI fails to address how this personality, how these different temperaments affect your regulation with each other, right? They're kind of like on their own islands, right? And it's easy to say, oh, feelers don't get along with thinkers, and perceivers don't get along with judgers. It's just so much more nuanced than that, and there's no accountability there for interaction dynamics. In socionics, you actually see this level up with intratype dynamics. You see like more like compatibility relationship summaries between types, which is cool. But PRISM really takes it a step further. It offers it offers something that I created called the Relational Adaptability Index to map stress triggers, flow patterns, and developmental tension across dyads. A lot to come there soon, but again, MBTI isn't really addressing any of these things. It's a lot of MBTI is just let open to interpretation. It became a meme instead of a map, right? And that's so true. Everybody likes to throw around the buzzword of MBTI, right? Everybody loves to throw around the buzzword of oh, I'm this, I'm that. Oh, you're tapping into this, you're tapping into that, and it's not really helping anybody, right? If anything, it's diluting from the value that MBTI has. And MBTI does have some fundamental value, but it's really been abused and overused. And it gives some funny. I have a funny example here. What MBTI type is your favorite sandwich, right? In its simplicity, it was made viral, but also made very shallow. And PRISM was born to offer a map, not a meme. It was offered to be able to give you application and a practical use case for your life, and to grow and to self-author your own growth. It's actionable, and it will be testable, and it's going to really make a crazy difference. Even socionics, and this is what I really enjoy about socionics. I enjoy socionics way more than MBTI for its further dimensionality and how it addresses transformation and growth for a personality type, not just to say this is what you are. What are my closing statements? MBTI, it has its warrants, but it's a great first step, right? If you use a metaphor like if psychology was math, right? MBTI is like the adding, the subtracting, and maybe dips and dabbles into the geometry. Whereas like socionics and now PRISM, that's like the arithmetic, and that's the physics, that's like getting into like the advanced stuff, right? And it makes sense that pop culture and society doesn't go into the super deep, the super detailed, because most people, they want to ingest information on a third grade level. And a lot of the stuff can sound complicated, and I totally get that. However, that doesn't mean that it's more objectively effective and correct, and it doesn't mean it has more warrants than something that is more advanced and hard to understand, right? We're not throwing out MBTI. It's just the first chapter of your growth here. It's the first chapter of really understanding personality systems and personality awareness, right? And I hope that in a perfect world, we share these kinds of videos with people that can really take away from it and understand. And I've created a community called Your Personality Blueprint. And I'd love to have you join. And I'm going to be mentioning it in every one of my videos going forward, so that we can foster a great community of people who do really want to grow, evolve in a meaningful and strategic way with these systems, so that we can use these systems in actual use cases. I did create a PRISM assessment test. You're more than happy to access that. And I hope to see you around in more of these videos. Comment, subscribe if you like this video. Let me know your thoughts on MBTI, and let me know how you've struggled with MBTI beyond just the buzzwordiness. Talk to you soon.